So one of the things I commonly do near the end of a class that I teach is I take a little time. I probably should wait and see if either of your classmates join you, but I talk a little bit about keeping in touch after the class. That's why I have this on the slide. I can show that again later if you're at all interested. Okay, in this session, what we are talking about is another one of the categories of culture that Kurt Hofstede first sort of pioneered. So individualism and collectivism, we talked about. Here we go! We were hoping you would come, Mari-san. And oh, you are perfectly, it is 10:11, and you heard me say yesterday, 5 to 10 minutes is overlooked. I hope Chanmi is on her way. I hope so. I think she is. We will leave the doors open, so we're safe. It will be a little colder in here, but we're tough. So, Kurt Hofstede was the researcher who pioneered individualism and collectivism, and also uncertainty avoidance. A third category that Kurt Hofstede first named and pioneered research into, he called it power distance. Power distance. And sometimes when I introduce it to students, they get confused and they think in high power distance cultures, some people are more powerful and other people are less powerful. And in low power distance cultures, everybody has the same power. And it's easy to understand why they make that mistake. Because if you visit someone in a low power distance culture, they pretend that that's true. They pretend nobody has more power, we're all equal. But I'm going to break it to you. Anytime there are human beings, some are more powerful and some are less powerful. That cannot be escaped. In a high power distance culture, they come right out and say it. Some people are more powerful, some are less powerful, and that is just how it is. In lower power distance cultures, people don't like to admit it. It's not nice to talk about it. It is looked down upon. And people try to share power as much as they can. But there's still power. In low power distance cultures, some people are more, some people are less. They just don't like that fact. The highest power distance culture by the data is India. The caste system is evidence of this. Some people are in the very top caste, some people are in the very bottom caste. And there is a widespread belief that no matter what you do, that cannot change. Some people would be powerful, some people will be powerless. The lowest, or one of the lowest power distance cultures in the world by the data is Australia. Their founding story of how the country of Australia came to be, how the Europeans arrived and started that political unit, was that they were all prisoners sent away from England. So the first people, white people from Europe, to settle Australia had no status, because it's not something to be proud of to be a prisoner. Therefore, today, in Australia, their prime minister is, I'll mispronounce his last name if I try it. It's Anthony Albanese, or what's an Italian name, I think. Right. If any Australian person were to meet him today, they'd call him Tony. And most places around the world, you don't call the head of your entire country by their first name. But in Australia, you do. In Australia, if you were to get a Rhodes Scholarship to where you got to go and study at Oxford and everything was paid for in Australia, you wouldn't tell anybody. Where I'm from, I would tell people. People would be excited. They would want to celebrate. In Australia, they would think you were saying you were better than they were, and they would start making fun of you until you understood you were no better than anybody else. That's what things look like, or a sketch of what it looks like in a low power distance culture. Now, Japan is very high, near the top in power distance. The people who are in charge are very in charge, and they should be obeyed, and you do not question them. The two things about Japanese culture that make it not completely high power distance are, first of all, the number of decisions made by consensus, where everybody has to agree. In high power distance cultures where it's maximized, the leader just makes the decision, and there is no consensus. The other thing about Japan that's not typical of a very high power distance culture is it is possible, if you work hard enough, to work your way up. In really high power distance cultures like India, for example, work as hard as you want, you will never be able to rise up in status or in wealth from where you started. Now, the United States is moderately low power distance. It's not at the very bottom. It's not where Australia is. The big difference that stops the United States from being low power distance is the big gap in wealth between the wealthiest and the most poor. The people with the most money have a lot of money in the United States, and the people with the least money have no money. And the size of that difference would not be tolerated in a low power distance culture. In the United States, there's a lot of admiration for people who are business leaders and who are rich. Donald Trump was elected president. Elon Musk is one of the most admired people in the country. What both of them have going for them is they're wealthy and they succeeded in business. And that kind of thing is not as common in a truly low power distance culture. But apart from that, in the United States, we like to pretend that you don't have to follow orders, that bosses have to listen to their employees. Those are all things you would find in a low power distance culture. So let me share with you a couple of published studies talking about evidence of where Japan is, then some of the characteristics you find in a low power distance culture. Then we're going to talk a little bit about where power comes from and how power is different, understood differently between the United States and Japan, and then we'll get to the biblical roots. Okay. A couple of researchers from Tokyo Institute of Technology, Taoka and Kagohashi, in 2018, they set up an experiment. They had European participants and Japanese participants, and they had them, all the participants were not designers. They had no design background. But the task was to design a logo for an organization. And they brought in a design expert, and they wanted to see what would happen with the two groups. The Europeans participating in it, they threw out lots of ideas and suggestions. The Japanese participants got very quiet because an expert was there, and the expert should just do it themselves and make all the decisions. And they said that was evidence of where Japan was as far as power distance. The Europeans thought it was okay to speak up even though they weren't experts. A 2019 study, I don't have the names of the researchers because I forgot, but it compared the idea of senpai and kohai across China, Korea, and Japan, and said that in China, senpai kohai is about who you turn to for support. And people talking about it in Korea said senpai and kohai, it's about who can you trust and what kind of language is it polite to use. But the participants from Japan, in talking about senpai and kohai, said it's all about who is higher in power and who is lower in power. So they found that the Japanese participants in that study made it more about power distance than Korean or Chinese participants. And the last one I'll mention, I mentioned quickly, I think 2 days ago, I think on Tuesday. This was a team of researchers from Belgium, America, and one named Uchida from Kyoto University. This was the one where they talked about situations that would spark the emotion of anger or of shame. And they asked American participants and Japanese participants, how recently have you been in a situation like this? Can you remember it? And the American participants could easily remember situations in which they had been angry, but they could not remember a situation in which they had felt shame. And the Japanese participants, other way around. They could remember when they felt shame, but the last time they felt anger, they couldn't remember one. That has a lot to do, those two emotions, with power distance. You feel shame when someone else has expected something and you haven't met it. You feel angry when you feel you have something that you legitimately expect and you didn't get it. All right. So characteristics of a low power distance culture. In low power distance cultures, and it's interesting given the question we had yesterday about young children, this may be another place where kind of like the consensus decision making and the ability to work your way up, that Japan is a little bit of an outlier. In low power distance cultures, parents, when they correct children, give a reason why. They will explain to the child, don't do this because. In high power distance cultures, parents just tell the children what to do, and they don't explain. Along with that, in low power distance cultures, parents are a lot more careful about how they discipline or punish their children. Sweden is very low power distance, and there, spanking or striking your child is against the law, and you can be prosecuted for it. In low power distance cultures, classrooms tend to have a lot of discussion and a lot of participation. And teachers will talk about the students as all of us, we are all scholars. We are all investigating and researching and learning, and we learn from each other. In a high power distance culture, the teacher is the authority. What the teacher says is correct, and the students are expected to learn it. We had the question in our uncertainty avoidance session, how did that affect education? And there was a story I was going to tell at the time. I'll quickly tell it now. A colleague of mine went and taught in China for a summer. And one day he taught his class, then went and had lunch. And after lunch, he was in a colleague's office, and he looked out the window, and he saw in the courtyard the students from his class walking around with their notebooks, reading them out loud. And he said to his colleague, "What are they doing?" And his colleague said, "They are memorizing your lecture, word for word." And that to them was how you learn. You write down what the teacher said, you memorize all of it, and when you can repeat back what the teacher said, then you learned. And in a low power distance culture, if the class is about how to give a speech, I tell students all the time, you have your own style, you have your own approach, and then I want to see them do it. And that's what learning looks like. One of the best examples, this would work wonderfully. If someone from a high power distance culture were to come back with me to the United States, to my college where I teach, they might see me have a conversation with Connie and with Reed, and talk to Connie and Reed about how their day is going. And that person from the high power distance culture might say, "Connie and Reed are very nice. They must be your friends." And I would say to them, "No, actually, Connie is my dean. She's my boss. And Reed, he's her boss. He's vice president of the university for academics." And it would confuse them because they would say, "But you called them by their first name." "Oh yeah, I've always done that. That's just what we do. We don't use titles." And in high power distance cultures, I might address Connie as, "Good morning, Dean." And I might address Reed as, "Good morning, Vice President." But we don't. Connie's been my friend for 14 years. All right. So what that brings us to, in talking about power, there's one more thing to say about the difference between Japan and the United States. A couple of sociologists, 70 years ago, they published a way of thinking about power, of breaking it into categories that has held up really, really well. People still make extensive use of this. Their names, which I did not put on here, this is my first marker moment of the day. I can find what I did with my markers. There they are. Their names are French and Raven. If I remember it right, John French and Bertram Raven. Originally they said there are 5 categories of power. They later added a 6th. First category of power, legitimate. Someone has legitimate power if they were put in the position they are in through a process that everyone agrees is either fair or traditional. Fair or traditional. It tends to be rooted in culture. I can give you 4 examples. I'll wait till you write down the explanation. But 4 examples. Charles is now the King of England. Why? Why is he the king? Why not one of his brothers or his sister? His sister is probably smarter than he is. One more time.
Because of tradition.
Exactly. He was Elizabeth's oldest son. And the oldest son, and I think now daughters have equal status, they didn't always, but the oldest child of whoever is the ruler is the next ruler. So Charles is the king, his power is legitimate. A second example, in democracies, if you win the election, you have power, and it is legitimate. And even people who voted for one of the other candidates, they need to accept your power. You won, and it was fair. A third example of legitimate power: parents and children. Sometimes parents are not the wisest, the best decision maker for the child, but we all accept that you need to respect a parent's opportunity to make decisions for the child. And a fourth example: students in a class and the teacher of the class. Sometimes my students back in the United States will come to me and say, my teacher in this other class is doing things I don't like. And I have to say, well, that's their class, and you signed up for it, and we need to respect that they're doing it their way. All of those are examples of legitimate power. A good way to think of it would be, if you could say, I may not respect the person, but I respect the position. And because I respect the position, I will do what the person asks. Then the power is legitimate. Four of the other five, it will be easier to explain, but the last one is going to take some explaining. The second one is expert power. Expert. You have power if you know how to do something most people can't do, or if you have knowledge most people don't have. Surgeons have a lot of expert power because they can perform surgery. They could save lives, and they know about medicine, and they have the techniques to cut human beings open and fix them. So that's very much about expert power. The next two are really easy because they are the mirror image of each other. They go together. Punishment power. Punishment power. That one is just what it sounds like. Someone has power if they are able to punish you. So police officers have power because they could put you under arrest and take you to jail. Children often do what adults tell them to because they know the adult can punish them. So that one's simple. So if the next one is the mirror image of this one, what do you think it is? It goes with punishment, but it's not punishment, it's the opposite. What do you think?
Reward.
Yeah. Your boss at the end of every pay period gives you your paycheck and you have money. Therefore, your boss has power. You coming up to your birthday or Christmas when you're a child, maybe when you're an adult, if you behave yourself, you get presents. So you behave really well to get those presents. Those two go together because very often the one who has the reward power also has punishment power. Your boss will pay you your pay. Your boss could also fire you, and that would be punishment. So I said before that French and Raven had to add an extra form of power. This is it. Information. If I have information that you don't have, that makes me powerful. And this one, they made separate because they said all the other kinds of power depend on the relationship between the people. But information doesn't. Information, as they were referring to it, referred to facts. Students sometimes ask me, what's the difference between information power and expert power? This is my answer. If I wanted you to, lock your door at night because there's crime in your neighborhood, I could be an expert on safety and tell you, I, in my expertise, am saying that will make you safer. Or I could tell you what the crime statistics are in your neighborhood. Now, I don't have to be an expert, but if I have that information and I give it to you, it might change your behavior. I might be a career expert, and I could tell you, this is what you should major in college, and then you'll be very happy. And that would be me being an expert. Or I could show you, for whatever major you have, what the employment and unemployment statistics are, and what the average pay is for people in that major. That's not my expertise, that's information. Do we see the difference? Okay. So that's information power. The last one, and the one I need to explain a little bit. Referent power. Referent power. Someone has referent power over you if you want them to be proud of you. If you admire them, if you look up to them, that's referent power. It's distinct from almost all the others, and definitely distinct from punishment power, because with referent power, it's very, very easy to exercise the power when you have it, and because the person receiving the power enjoys it. If they know that you are proud of them and they admire and look up to you, that feels good, and they'll seek out more of it. Punishment power, when you use punishment as a source of power over people, they will learn not to get caught, and they will learn to become more powerful than you, so you can't punish them anymore. They will try to grow until they take your power away. But with referent power, they don't try to take your power away, they enjoy it. So wherever we have found human beings, referent power is one of the most sustainable and one of the most effective. The thing about it is, it can be very breakable. It can be very fragile. Because if you make mistakes, the person who admires and looks up to you might stop doing so. All right. I said all of that so that I could say this. In Japan, legitimate power is very, very important. And Japanese people respond to legitimate power, and in the United States, they don't. Throughout the history of the country, Americans have been very skeptical, very resistant to legitimate power. The United States of America was founded with breaking away from the authority of a king. We started our country by saying the king is no longer in charge. And today, legitimate power is even weaker than it has ever been. And even information power is getting weaker in the United States because of the distrust of institutions. And this is preparing us for tomorrow's session after lunch, the one where we talk about why did so many Christians vote for Donald Trump? Because they distrust their sources of information and they distrust organizations. So this is something we will talk about more. All right. So that brings us then to the Christian roots. And what I want to do, as I have often done, let's see. I don't want to get these out of order. I want, first of all, to share with you two passages from Jesus' teaching. What Jesus said to the people who came out to hear him preach. For the first one, back in those days, there were the Judeans who lived around Jerusalem in what is now Israel. But there were lots of people who were not Jewish. They were called, and this is a decent word to put on the board, they were Gentiles. And it was roughly similar to Gaijin living in Japan, because there were the people who were local, who were of the land, shared the language, shared the same faith. Then there were people who had come from outside, different language, different faith. And Jesus, first of all, is going to talk about them. And here we are. Boom, boom, boom. So that was Jesus talking about the Gentiles, the people from outside, and their own leaders. Not long after, in the second passage, this one's a bit longer. This is 12 verses. But he's going to talk about the leaders of his own people, the religious leaders of his own religion. And he's going to have pretty much the same teaching. Okay, the one more passage I want to share with you I've said a couple of times I had moments when I thought, this class actually makes sense. One of them was discovering or applying the Henrich research about how the Catholics' program for marriage and family was behind individualism and collectivism. Another was when I was teaching argumentation, and I went looking for what are the differences between Japanese argument and American argument, and researchers with no Christian background said it's actually American argument is rooted in what the Bible teaches them about authority. And that is the passage I want to share with you right now. I'll start it in a moment, but what is happening here is Jesus' followers are called in before the religious teachers, and the religious teachers tell them, stop teaching about Jesus. And this is what they said. There we go. So, the teaching that comes out both from what Jesus taught and also from what his followers taught afterward was that authority is to be confronted. And when authority is wrong, you ought to resist authority. And the one other thing that I realized that I was going to share with you, it's easy to think, and I think most world religions teach, that God's power is primarily punishment and reward. But what the Bible teaches, as far as Christian teaching, is that punishment and reward are no longer what ought to motivate someone who's a follower of Jesus. Instead, as a result of what Jesus did and then gave as a free gift, his power should be referent. That all the power should be the choices you make moment to moment are the choices that you know would please him. And the more that power is exercised, the more pleasant it is, the more you seek to be in that power. Okay. I have 10:50. I am also going to say I don't think Chunmi is going to join us, which makes me sad, but the good news is I'm going to close the doors and the room will get warmer. Okay. Let me kill the recorder. Chunmi, if you listen to this later, we miss you.